In the opening weeks of World War I, the German light cruiser SMS Emden had already carved a notorious reputation on the seas, sinking or capturing a significant portion of Allied merchant shipping. In just a short span of time, nearly 60% of Allied commerce in the region had been crippled, striking fear into traders and naval officers alike. This wave of disruption emboldened her captain, Karl von Müller, a man whose calm, precision, and bold strategies made him stand apart as a commander. Rather than being content with harassing isolated merchantmen, von Müller sought a target that would echo across the empire, something that would not just damage Britain's pocket but also its prestige. On the night of the 22nd of September 1914, Emden approached Madras, one of the most important ports of the British Empire on the Indian coastline. The port, a hub of trade and military logistics, had oil storage tanks exposed along the shore, glowing faintly under the harbor lights. Using the cover of darkness, Emden silently glided through the waters until the vast silhouettes of the tanks came into sight. Her crew loaded the 4.1-inch naval guns and locked them on the shore. As searchlights swept the sea and revealed the undefended coastline, the order was given and the guns thundered. The first rounds splashed short, but the third salvo struck home. In an instant, fire roared skyward as 5,000 tons of oil erupted into an inferno. The harbor shook, the flames illuminated the night sky, and the people of Madras watched in terror as destruction swept across the waterfront. On the bridge of his ship, von Müller stood quietly, neither gloating nor panicking, but feeling the weight of the moment. It was both exhilarating and foreboding, for he knew that this single act would bring down upon him the full wrath of the Royal Navy. His lone cruiser had just provoked the mightiest fleet on earth, and soon it would be 14 ships against one. Yet, in his heart, von Müller welcomed this challenge, for he had always known his destiny lay not in hiding, but in daring the impossible. At the turn of the 20th century, Germany was a power on the rise. Its ambitions stretched far beyond Europe, into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, where the empire sought to carve out colonies and influence. To secure its interests in East Asia, Germany relied on the Imperial East Asia Squadron, based at the fortified port of Tsingtao in China. The squadron was commanded by a seasoned admiral whose fleet combined armored cruisers and light cruisers, fast and maneuverable vessels that could project power across the oceans. Yet the age of steam had transformed naval warfare into a delicate balance of logistics. A warship was no longer dependent on the wind but on coal, and without constant access to fuel, even the most formidable vessel was nothing but a floating hulk of steel, vulnerable and immobile. The Allies, aware of this dependency, had no intention of allowing Germany's East Asian stronghold to endure. With war looming in Europe, the squadron's days at Tsingtao were already numbered. But among its ships was one that did not need a battle fleet at its side to make an impact. Emden, light and swift, would fight her war on her own terms. In 1913, Karl von Müller, a career naval officer with more than 2 decades of service, assumed command of SMS Emden, the Dresden-class cruiser, displacing about 3,500 tons, was sleek, fast, and modern. Müller was a man of discipline and quiet authority, respected for his measured temperament and meticulous attention to detail. His officers and sailors trusted him completely, for he led not with fear but with a steady hand. By his side was his second-in-command, a younger officer whose fiery daring complemented Müller's calculated restraint, together forming a balance of order and audacity. In the summer of 1914, while the world seemed poised on the edge of crisis, daily life in Tsingtao still carried on with an air of normalcy. The harbor bustled with the sounds of sailors, merchants, and officials, while across Europe, newspaper headlines grew increasingly grim. That June, the British cruiser HMS Minotaur arrived for a port call, and what followed was a scene of surprising camaraderie. The German East Asia Squadron hosted an elaborate reception for their supposed rivals. Officers dined together at a grand banquet. Laughter filled the rooms, and glasses were raised in toasts to shared seas rather than war. Sailors from both sides mingled, trading jokes and stories, while in the following days friendly competitions of sport further strengthened the sense of fellowship. On the surface, the mood was one of goodwill, and as Minotaur prepared to sail away, no one could imagine that Britain and Germany would so soon stand as bitter enemies locked in global conflict. Yet beneath the laughter, preparations were already underway. Orders had come to replace seasoned sailors on several German ships with newer recruits, and drills became relentless. On board Emden, the men grew quickly accustomed to the rhythm of their ship, which could reach a maximum speed of 25 knots. They learned the workings of her 10 4.1-inch main guns, her lighter 5-pounder pieces, her machine guns, and her torpedo tubes. Every man was drilled to efficiency, for when war came there would be no time for hesitation. The storm broke on the 28th of June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. The killing set off a chain reaction of ultimatums and alliances, drawing one nation after another into conflict. Within weeks, Europe was ablaze. What would be called the Great War, or World War I, had begun. Emden did not have to wait long to taste her first hunt. On the 4th of August 1914, patrolling off the coast of the Korean peninsula in the dark hours of early morning, her lookouts spotted shapes against the horizon. 4 tall, slender funnels broke the line of the sea. The unmistakable silhouette of a warship emerging out of the dawn mist. Suspecting the distant silhouette might be the Russian protected cruiser scarce, a vessel whose capture would be a triumph of both prestige and power. The cry of action rippled across Emden's decks. The tension was immediate, alive in the rush of boots against steel and the shouts of sailors scrambling to their stations. Spotlights swept the waves, revealing only fragments of the distant form, enough to quicken the pulse of every man aboard. The gunners swung their weapons into position, their hands steady but their hearts racing at the thought that they might face a fully armed enemy warship. Captain Karl von Müller, composed yet alert, gave the decisive order to intercept, and with a roar of vengeance, Emden surged ahead, her turbines straining at full power as the distance between hunter and quarry shrank rapidly. The Russian vessel did not respond to signals to halt, and so Müller gave the order to fire warning shots. Great flashes erupted from Emden's guns, thunder rolling across the sea, the shells splashing dangerously close until at last the ship yielded. The German boarding party vaulted across, weapons at the ready, expecting to find themselves upon the decks of a Russian cruiser. Instead, to their surprise and faint disappointment, they discovered they had not captured Askold, but the merchant steamer Ryazan, a 3,500-ton vessel of far less glamour, but not without value. Though her holds were light of precious cargo, Müller saw at once the prize she truly was. Fast, modern, and strong, Ryazan was a vessel that could be turned to Germany's use. He was not a man to waste opportunity. At dawn on August 6th, Emden steamed proudly into Tsingtao with Ryazan in tow, the black, white, and red of the German war flag now flying over her deck. Within weeks, the captured merchantmen had been refitted and repainted, reborn as the auxiliary cruiser SMS Cormoran, ready to serve Germany's cause as a raider in distant seas. That the war was still in its infancy when Admiral Maximilian von Spee, a commander with decades of experience, found himself faced with a decision that might shape the fate of his squadron. His force, composed of 2 armored cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and a fleet of supply ships, lay far from home. Their base at Tsingtao offered safety for the moment, but coal was the lifeblood of steam warships, and without it, even the mightiest vessel became a helpless carcass adrift on the waves. Allied forces were already moving to contain and destroy him, and to remain in East Asia would mean inevitable entrapment. Von Spee chose instead to lead his squadron across the vast Pacific towards South America. Their neutral ports might provide coal, and British merchant shipping would offer targets easier to reach. Before departing, however, he made a fateful choice. He ordered Emden to stay behind, to fight her war alone. The light cruiser, with her agility and daring commander, would be the lone wolf, prowling the Indian Ocean and distracting the Allies. Her only companion was the collier Macamonia, laden with 6,000 tons of coal, her fragile lifeline in a sea ruled by enemies. Müller understood at once that such a mission would demand ingenuity, for coal was not a gift that would last forever. If Emden hoped to endure, she would have to hunt her own supply and rely on deception as much as gunnery. On August 14th, Emden and Marco Mania slipped into the vast waters, embarking on their solitary cruise. Müller's first act of cunning was to alter the very shape of his ship. He ordered a false funnel built amidships, transforming Emden's silhouette into the four-funneled outline of a British county-class cruiser. It was a simple illusion, but deadly effective, for, to a distant eye, the ship now resembled a friendly escort. Merchant captains might lower their guard, believing themselves safe, only to realize too late that they had allowed a predator to draw near. It was the perfect disguise for a raider that thrived on surprise. By late August, the two vessels had entered the Bay of Bengal, one of the Empire's busiest sea lanes. British commanders believed Emden still sailed with von Spee's squadron, and so no precautions had been taken in this region. The German cruiser moved freely, unseen and unsuspected. Yet her first days of hunting yielded little, and the coal bunkers began to run low. Müller's face grew drawn as he watched the gauges, knowing that without replenishment, his mission might end before it had begun. On the night of September 9th, with anxiety mounting, he ordered his officers to scan every horizon for the glow of smoke or light. Hours passed in tense silence until at last a faint shimmer appeared against the darkness. Engines thundered to life, and Emden leaped forward like a wolf, scenting its prey. The distance melted swiftly, and within minutes, the German cruiser bore down on her quarry. A shot cracked across the bow, and the startled vessel obeyed the signal to halt. The boarding party stormed aboard, and the ship was identified as the Greek steamer. Greece was neutral, but neutrality meant little when her holds contained 6,500 tons of coal, destined for the British naval base at Bombay. Müller confronted the captain with two choices: surrender the ship to German hands, or follow in Emden's wake and supply her, with the promise that his crew and vessel would remain unharmed. Reluctantly, the Greek captain agreed, and with that decision, Emden's tiny force gained a new member. Müller had bought time, and he intended to use it to the fullest. The Bay of Bengal, once considered secure, was suddenly no longer safe. A single cruiser had turned it into a hunting ground. German records later described Emden's mission as that of a wolf let loose among sheep, striking quickly, doing maximum damage, and slipping away before the enemy's superior strength could close in. On September 10th, the lookout spotted a British steamer against the horizon. She carried strange white structures upon her deck that raised questions, but Müller was not deterred. Signals ordered the vessel to halt, and when she complied, the boarding party climbed aboard. Instead of hidden guns, they found rows of horse stalls. The ship was the SS Indus, a British transport carrying cavalry mounts for the Indian Army. Her crew was taken off, her cargo noted, and explosives placed. With a violent roar, the vessel was sent beneath the waves. The strike was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Emden captured two more merchantmen, SS Lovett and SS Killen. Each time the pattern was the same. The prey was overtaken, the crews removed, and the ships destroyed. Cargoes were seized, lifeboats lowered, and the vessels sent to the depths. The seas that had seemed safe were now shadowed by fear. Captains whispered the name of the lone German raider, a phantom that might appear at any horizon, her false funnels masking her true nature until it was far too late. Each sinking or capture became a warning to every British vessel still daring to sail through those waters. What had once been considered a secure expanse of sea, the Bay of Bengal, was now gripped by fear and uncertainty. The German cruiser SMS Emden had transformed it into a hunting ground, a place where no merchant captain could feel safe. Captain Karl von Müller and his crew were not merely intent on seizing ships and their valuable cargo. They sought opportunities to launch strikes that would shake the very foundations of British control in the region. On the night of September 22, 1914, Müller set his sights on a target that would reverberate across the empire: the city of Madras, home to the Burma Oil Company's massive storage depots. Destroying those tanks would not only cripple, British fuel reserves, but also deliver a psychological blow of unprecedented scale. Generations had passed since an Indian coastal city had experienced an attack, and despite orders for a blackout, the streets of Madras remained illuminated, betraying a sense of complacency. The city was not completely defenseless. 4 shore batteries were stationed along the coastline, but against a swift and elusive raider like Emden, their presence meant little. The stage was set for a dramatic strike, as darkness cloaked the waters. Emden approached silently, moving less than 2 miles from the coast by 10 o'clock that night. The vessel slowed almost to a crawl, her crew tense but disciplined, every man knowing what was at stake. Before the first shot was fired, Müller issued strict orders to his gunners. No shell was to fall upon the city itself. The target was the oil tanks, and nothing else. The first rounds missed, one soaring harmlessly overhead, and the other crashing into the shore. The crew quickly recalibrated. When the third shell struck, it found its mark. A tank ruptured, spilling its contents, and within seconds, a raging fire erupted, lighting the night sky and turning the harbor into a blazing inferno. On Emden's deck, sailors erupted into cheers, their faces glowing in the orange light of destruction. Another salvo followed, hitting a second tank, though it was fortunately empty. The next rounds tore into the well-stocked yard, and soon smoke poured upward in thick black columns. Flames consumed more than 5,000 tons of oil in minutes, painting the sea and sky with devastation. By then, the British shore batteries had opened fire, their shells screaming across the water in a desperate attempt to drive off the attacker, but their aim was poor and their response too late. The German cruiser maneuvered calmly back into open waters, the shells splashing harmlessly into the sea around her. Emden remained untouched, her crew unfazed, while behind them the great city of Madras burned. Panic seized the population. Residents poured into the streets, fleeing in fear that more shells would fall or that further attacks might come. For the people of Madras, the war had suddenly arrived on their doorstep. For the British Empire, the strike was a humiliation, a revelation that their far-flung territories were not beyond reach. A single German cruiser had turned their supposed stronghold into a place of terror by the time of the Madras bombardment. Emden had already claimed 10 merchant vessels. Yet even as he carved his name into naval history, Müller never abandoned his code of honor. Captured sailors were treated with respect, given time to gather their belongings, and often provided with food or supplies for the uncertain journeys that lay ahead. If women or children were discovered on a vessel, Müller would release it rather than destroy it. This unusual conduct earned him and his ship a reputation as both a fearsome enemy and a chivalrous one. Tales of his raids spread quickly, mingling respect with fear. From the Suez Canal to Singapore, from the ports of Japan to the harbors of Australia, merchant captains hesitated to set sail, fearing they might become the next victims of the elusive raider. British pride, however, was dealt the hardest blow. In the space of only a month, one cruiser, cut off from any friendly port or reinforcement, had managed to outmaneuver for enemy navies and reduce Indian Ocean shipping by 60%. Chambers of commerce across the empire erupted in panic. Telegrams were sent in haste, resolutions passed, and urgent demands for action shouted in parliament and press alike. The response was enormous. No fewer than 78 warships of the British, French, Russian, and Japanese fleets were dispatched to the Indian Ocean, scouring thousands of miles of sea in pursuit of the elusive German cruiser. Yet despite their overwhelming numbers, Müller's ship remained a step ahead, sinking ships more quickly than replacements could be sent. The Allies found themselves stretched thin, their trade routes disrupted, their commerce bleeding losses, rather than risk more ships being captured or sunk. British commanders were eventually forced to withdraw entire squadrons from some areas, leaving wide stretches of ocean exposed. After weeks of relentless raiding, Müller sought respite. In early October, Emden turned toward Diego Garcia, a lonely British colonial outpost over 1,000 miles south of India. To Müller's mind, approaching a British harbor meant preparing for danger, for he expected cannons, fortifications, and perhaps warships lying in wait. Yet as the cruiser glided into the lagoon, silence greeted her. No guns fired, no alarm bells rang. To the astonishment of the crew, the islanders welcomed them with open arms. News of the war had not yet reached Diego Garcia. To the British residents there, Germany was still a friend, not a foe. Müller seized the opportunity. He anchored openly, and for the first time in weeks, the exhausted crew breathed freely. They ate fresh food, washed away the grime of their voyage, and enjoyed the luxury of rest. Their uniforms were repaired, their ship freshly painted, and vital maintenance carried out. Engineers patched her worn hull and machinery, while coal was replenished to restore her range. Before departing, Müller demonstrated his gratitude by having his men repair a local boat. An act that further cemented the image of Emden, not just as a predator, but as a ship commanded by a gentleman of war. When she departed nearly a week later, she was restored, her crew reinvigorated, and her hull ready for more strikes. The cruiser steamed north toward the Lacative Islands and struck again. In mid-October, she sank 5 steamers, among them a Tasmanian dredger, and captured a large collier to replenish her fuel stores. Once more, she seemed unstoppable. Then she disappeared. For weeks, there was no trace of her movements. Allied ships searched desperately, scouring the ocean for clues. It was not until more than 1,700 miles from her last reported sighting that Emden reappeared. And when she did, it was in a manner so bold and theatrical that observers later described it as spectacular enough to please even the most jaded imagination. It was toward the end of October that Müller fixed his sights on Penang, a vital port in British-controlled Malaya, situated along one of the empire's busiest trade routes. Penang was home to merchants, supply vessels, and occasionally even warships. Its defenses, however, were minimal, making it a tempting target for a raider like Emden. At dawn, on October 29th, the port slumbered under a heavy tropical mist. The harbor, normally alive with the clatter of tugboats, launches, and sampans, lay eerily quiet, its residents still asleep. Slowly, the mist began to rise, like a curtain pulled back from a stage, and the scene that emerged was one poised to erupt into chaos through the grey haze of early morning. Emden's lookout strained his eyes toward the anchored silhouettes in Penang harbor. One vessel stood out, her lights still glowing in the mist. The Russian cruiser Gimchug, a ship that had once carried prestige but now sat vulnerable. She was in port for repairs, her boilers crippled, with only one operational. This meant she could not maneuver, could not steam for safety. And her ammunition hoists were useless, rendering her unable to fight at full strength. To a hunter like Captain Karl von Müller, she was an irresistible target, a victim already marked by fate. Aboard Gimchug, the stillness of the dawn was broken only by the quiet routine of the quartermaster on watch. His eyes caught a steamer emerging from the east, its outline a blur in the dim half-light. He studied the figure carefully through his spyglass. The shape sharpened, a 2-masted vessel, 4 funnels rising in a familiar line. To any naval man, this profile was unmistakably the form of a British cruiser. The quartermaster exhaled in relief, convinced it must be HMS Yarmouth, known to be patrolling nearby. He hesitated, briefly considering raising an alarm, but the serenity of the harbor and the sheer improbability of an enemy raid pushed the thought away. Who would dare strike here, under the very nose of British and Allied strength? Surely no German warship could be so bold. He let the thought pass, unaware of the danger approaching silently through the fog. The mysterious ship continued forward, gliding with confidence, closing the gap until she lay only 300 yards off Gimchug's beam. On board the newcomer, however, there was no calm, no relaxation. Every man of Emden's crew was awake, at his station, hands ready on the guns, breath held as the moment of truth approached. On Gimchug, most of the crew still slept below, their hammocks swinging gently, utterly unaware of the peril looming just outside. Then, in a sudden and shocking instant, the deception ended. A German ensign shot up Emden's mast, fluttering defiantly in the dawn light. A heartbeat later, her broadside thundered, point blank, the guns vomiting fire and steel into Gimchug's exposed hull. The first salvo crashed into the cruiser, tearing open her plates, blasting apart the decks with devastating force. Panic erupted aboard the Russian vessel as explosions thundered through the steel body of the ship. Half-asleep sailors scrambled from their bunks, some already wounded or dead before they could even reach the deck. A torpedo streaked from Emden, its impact striking true, exploding with such violence that a column of water, flame, and smoke towered over the harbor. Another salvo followed, then another, shells raking Gimchug without mercy. In the harbor, the silence of dawn was gone, replaced by chaos, confusion, and fear. Sailors screamed as the cruiser listed heavily, her stern dragging down into the sea. Within moments, the proud Russian ship was doomed, her hull ripped apart, her engines silenced forever. The thick morning mist that had hung over Penang was now consumed by rolling clouds of black smoke rising from the wreck. When it finally began to clear, the only part of Gimchug that remained above the water was her mast, protruding eerily over the surface. Surrounded by floating wreckage and the desperate cries of her scattered survivors. In less than 15 minutes from the moment of first contact, the battle was over. Emden was already slipping silently away, her mission complete. Her crew steady at their posts as though nothing unusual had happened, but Müller was not finished. Before departing Penang, he turned his guns on the French destroyer, Musquet. The smaller ship was quickly overwhelmed, and after sinking her, Müller demonstrated again his code of conduct by stopping long enough to pick up her survivors from the water, even as two nearby French destroyers gave chase. Emden's superior speed and her captain's mastery of deception and maneuver carried her once more out to the open sea. The elusive German raider had vanished again, leaving only ruin and legend in her wake. For weeks she disappeared into the vastness of the ocean, her whereabouts a mystery that tormented Allied commanders. Then, on November 9th, she reappeared, her sights set on the Cocos Islands, a remote British atoll far out in the Indian Ocean. At first glance, the islands themselves held little importance, but concealed there was a treasure far greater than gold, an undersea telegraph cable, and a powerful radio station, a vital link in the chain that connected Australia, India, Africa, and beyond. It was the artery through which Britain's empire pulsed with news, orders, and lifeblood. To cut it would be to silence a continent. On that morning, Müller was confident. His wireless operators had listened carefully to radio traffic, and believed no Allied warships were near enough to interfere. What he did not know was that a massive Allied troop convoy, carrying Australian soldiers to the battlefields of Europe, and escorted by powerful warships, was steaming in silence just 55 miles away. Emden's luck, built on daring, was about to run out. Yet unaware of this, Müller pressed on with precision and resolve. His captured British collier, Berisk, was ordered to wait offshore as Emden prepared the strike. Just after dawn, 50 men led by Lieutenant Helmuth von Muck, Müller's brilliant and daring second-in-command, climbed into 3 boats and rowed toward Direction Island. They carried rifles, demolition charges, and iron determination. Their mission was simple: destroy the cable and wireless station, no matter the cost. Among them were some of Emden's finest gunners, spared from their usual stations so they could ensure the destruction was thorough and quick. As they advanced, a lone Chinese worker spotted the men. Shocked, he sprinted desperately to the telegraph station, his lungs burning, his heart racing. Bursting through the door, he hammered at the key and sent a frantic Morse transmission. SOS, Emden here, on Emden's bridge. Müller heard the call at once, and barked an order to jam the signal. His operators complied, sending out static to choke the airwaves, but it was too late. The warning had already raced through the undersea cable and across the skies, reaching distant receivers. British warships now knew help would come. Still, Müller pressed on, knowing hesitation would doom him. Emden held her position offshore, silent and menacing, while on Direction Island, von Muck's landing party worked undisturbed, unaware of the sword about to fall. Just over a mile away, aboard HMS Minotaur, men read the desperate distress call. The Royal Navy's great hunt for the German raider had suddenly narrowed to a single point. What made the moment stranger was the memory still fresh in the minds of some British sailors. Only months earlier, In the port of Tsingtao, they had shared drinks, laughter, and camaraderie with the very crew they were now racing to destroy. Now the time for friendship was gone. War had turned the ocean into a stage where fate would decide who would live and who would sink beneath the waves. Asterisk.